Bukhari, Suyuti, names go on and on, but they all come after 923. Nothing before 923. So basically what we're saying is everything we know about Muhammad, everything we know about his life, everything we know about how the Quran was put together, everything we know about what he said that happened in this period here, does not get written down till this period, 200 to 300 years later. Does that bother any of you? Please say yes. It should bother all of you. Why? Well, can you imagine if we were to apply the same criteria to Jesus? Now, when did Jesus die? We know he died in about 33 AD. Did people write down what he did? Yes, they did. Almost immediately, didn't they? You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who wrote down the biography of Jesus. That would be the Sirah of Jesus, the Siratu of Yesu, or Isa. So you have the biographies written down. We know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written by between 48 and 64 AD. So within 30 to 40 years, you already have 3 biographies of Jesus. John would have been written later. That's about 60 years later. But 2 of those biographers actually knew Jesus. John and Matthew lived with him for 3 years. They saw everything he did. They heard everything he said. So they wrote down what they saw and they wrote down what they heard. We don't just have 1 biography, we have 4 biographies. 2 of them written by eyewitnesses, and the other 2 who got them from the eyewitnesses. 40 to 60 years after Christ's death. What about the tafsir of Jesus? That would be the commentaries. Well, the tafsir of Jesus would be the letters of Paul. He was the one that actually commented on what Jesus did. What Jesus did, he showed how to apply what Jesus did in Ephesus, in Philippi, in Corinth. Those are the commentaries on Jesus' life. And Paul was beginning to write down within 15 years of Jesus' death. Not 300 years, but within 15 years, Paul was writing down these tafsir of Jesus. Do you see the parallels? What about the Tahrik, the histories of the early church? The book of Acts, written by Luke. And we know the book of Acts had to be written between 52 and 62 AD. Jesus died in 33 AD. So within 20 to 30 years, you have the Acts of the Apostles written. Which means everything we know about Jesus is written down within 15 to 60 years while the eyewitnesses were still living. John was still living. He was the last to write something down. Whereas everything we know about Muhammad is written 200 to 300 years after the fact. Ooh my, look at the differences. If we were dependent on what we know of Jesus concerning what Muslims are dependent on, that means, let me just go back. That means we would not know anything about Jesus until the 3rd century. How could we defend him? How could we even know what he did or said if nothing began to appear until the 3rd century? That's why I love my Bible. And that's why I love the person of Jesus Christ. That's why I can trust what I know about him. Because they were written down so early. And you might say, hold on a minute, the 1st century, that's so early. Could people read or write? Listen, these were fishermen. How did they know how to read or write? Well, Matthew wasn't a fisherman. He knew how to read or write. And John used a scribe to write for him. Luke certainly was a doctor. He knew how to read or write. And Mark knew how to read and write. Of course they knew how to read or write. And Paul, goodness sakes, he was one of the most intelligent men of his day. Of course he knew how to read or write. So why could not the Muslims? Where were their Pauls, Luke's, John's, and Paul's? Sorry, I just said Paul. Matthew's and Mark's. Where are their readers and writers? Why could they not do the same thing in the 7th century? Or the 8th century? Why do we have to wait to the 9th century to have anything written down? Can you see why now historians are starting to look at the Quran, are starting to look at Islam, are starting to look at Muhammad with a completely new eye? And this is what they're asking. Islam as we know it did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. The Quran probably was not revealed to one man in a 22-year period, like the classical account says, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. We're going to deal with that one next week. Let's talk about the first one. did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over the period of 200 to 300 years. The conclusion they're coming to is the history of Islam, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik, and we're going to talk about more later tonight, and before, is a later fabrication. Now, that's a huge amount to say, and you're probably, if there's any Muslims in the audience, they would get very angry with me for saying that. But let me just show you what we're doing and what we're saying. Here's the questions. This is their concerns. If so much of the history of early Islam was written down so late, why did it take so long to write it down? Were these people illiterate? I hear that all the time whenever I ask my Muslim friends this. They were illiterate. I said, hold on a minute. No, they weren't illiterate. By 642, within 10 years of Muhammad's death, Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo were controlled by Islam, or at least by Arabs. Those are huge cities. These had lots of libraries. They could read and write for hundreds of years, thousands of years in these cities. Please don't say no one knew how to read and write in those cities. By 685, by the time Abdul Malik comes to power, all of North Africa, all the way from Spain in the west, in the other direction, all the way to India in the east, that whole swath of land was under their control. Are you telling me that from Spain to India, nobody could read or write? Not one person? No, of course they could read or write. In fact, they tell me, we're going to find out next week, that the Quran was written down by Zayd ibn Thabit in 632 to 634. Within 2 years of Muhammad's death, the Quran was first written down by a man named Zayd ibn Thabit, who was the scribe of Muhammad, the secretary of Muhammad. His whole job was to read and write. So where did the 9th century biographers get their material from? And since we don't have anything before the 9th century, can we trust it, since it's so late? Shouldn't we go back to the period these events took place? Shouldn't we go back to the 7th century and see what we find? And that's, as a historian, is what we need to do. Let's go back and see what we can find in the 7th century. And that's what now a whole slew of historians have begun to do, especially here in Britain. This is coming out of Europe more so than America. And this is why I heard nothing about this when I was in America. I only started hearing this in 1994. And that's why we've been working with this now for the last 20 years. And the people I'm going to go to are these scholars. Dr. John Wansborough, head of department at School of Oriental and African Studies here in the University of London. Wrote 2 books, Quranic Studies and Sectarian Milieu, in 1977 and 1978. And it's those 2 books that broke open this whole question. And he asked some very simple questions. Questions that should have been asked hundreds of years ago. If, when you look at the Quran, take a look at all the stories in the Quran, they just don't make sense for a 7th century environment. They make much more sense once the Muslims or the Arabs had moved out into the diaspora, where they would have come across these stories. Because these stories, actually, we know where the stories come from. Story of Cain and Abel in Surah 5, Ayah 31. That comes from the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah. The story of Abraham in Surah 21, Ayah 51 to 71. A great story but it does not come from the Bible. It actually comes from the Mishnah Rabbah. The story of Solomon and Sheba in Surah 27, Ayah 17 to 44. A terrific story with the hoopoe bird and the Queen of Sheba pulling up her skirts and she has hairy legs. That story does not come at all from my Bible. I don't remember her ever pulling up her skirts. Nor do I remember a hoopoe bird that could talk. Or that Solomon, who had created an entire air force that would drop stones on the enemy with the name of the enemy at the bottom of the stones. This is not in my Bible. I would have loved to have had that story in Sunday school. For one very good reason. It's from the second Targum of Esther, which was written in the 2nd century. It was nothing more than an apocryphal account written by the Jews in the 2nd century, and nothing more than as entertainment for their children. Yet you find it in Surah 27, Ayah 17 to 44. They shouldn't have ever put it in the Quran. This does not come from God. It doesn't even come from His scripture. It comes from nothing more than a folk tale for children. So Wansborough was asking these questions in 1977. In 1978. Dr. Gerald Hotting, my professor at School of Oriental and African Studies, is one that has probably done the best job of looking at the 1st century and unpacking what we now know. Dr. Patricia Krona used to study under Dr. John Wansborough. She then went and became head of department at Oxford University, wrote a book called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam. We're going to use some of her work tonight. She got a death threat from Muslims for writing that book in 1987. moved to Cambridge University, and that's where I got to know her. I did a debate on this material in 1995. So you can see, this is over 20 years ago that I did this. Did I say 100? 20 years ago. I'm not that old yet. 20 years ago, I did a debate on this material with Dr. Jamal Badawi, probably the head scholar of his day in the Muslim world in 1990s. And I asked 10 questions that I got from Dr. Patricia Corona. Dr. Patricia Corona was head of department at Cambridge University at that time. She was the one that helped me put that debate together. Dr. Patricia Corona reads and writes 15 archaic languages. These are languages that are not spoken anymore today. 15 of them she reads and writes. She is considered to be the top in the world in her field. How many of you can read and write even modern day 15 languages? Can you see the kind of scholarship we're dealing with here? She finally left and went to Princeton University, was head of a department at Princeton University before she died just a few months ago. But it's her material that blew this all open, as you're going to see later on in our talk today. Dr. Andrew Rippin was University of Calgary, was probably the best one that took all this material and brought it down to layman's terminology so the rest of us could understand it. Dr. Robert Hoyland, head of department when I knew him at Oxford University, does the best job of taking all the extra Quranic and extra Arabic material and puts it together and says, what kind of people are we talking about? What kind of places are we talking about in the 7th century? He reads and writes 18 languages. These are linguists. These are the top scholars in the world who have now geared their material on the Quran. Dr. Yehuda Neva, head of department at Jerusalem University, who has done the best work at looking at all the inscriptions from that part of the world and transcribing them and showing us that we've got a real problem when we look at the earliest Arab inscriptions. I'll be using some of his material later on. And then the German school. The Germans have been way ahead of everybody else when it comes to the manuscript evidence. And I'll be dealing with them more next week. Dr. Gerd Lulling, Dr. Hans Lulling, sorry. Dr. Gerd Twin, Dr. von Bothmer, and Dr. OLEH. They're the ones who actually looked at the earliest manuscripts, which we'll talk about next week. But these are scholars, top scholars in the world, who are now using their expertise, asking the same questions that had been asked about the Bible. Dr. Gerald Hotting, the first day of class, he said, I've spent 20 years confronting the Bible. 20 years using redacted criticism, using source criticism, using historical criticism, using literary criticism against the Bible. I finally gave up after 20 years. But since I had all these different criticisms, since I had all this scholarship under my belt, I just started taking the same material and applying it to the Quran and to the early emergence of the Quran. And that's why 20 Muslims had to leave his class, because of what he was telling us and what he was saying. So, 2 new books have come out and 1 documentary here in Britain that you need to know about that you can get. One of them is In the Shadow of the Sword. How many of you know about this book? In the Shadow of the Sword, written by Dr. Tom Holland. Now, Dr. Tom Holland is not a historian. He got his doctorate in English literature. But he's a great storyteller. And he has written all kinds of historical books. In fact, almost every one of his books have been bestsellers. He came out with this book in 2012 after spending 6 years of studying the emergence of Islam, because he'd written Rubicon, he'd written Persian Fire, he had written, what was the one on the Byzantine world? Anybody know the third one that he's written? Rubicon, Persian Fire, and I can't remember the third one. But those are all the histories leading up to Islam. So he is the best place to write the next chapter. How did Islam begin? And he went to all these different scholars, Krohn, Hotting, Hoyland, went to Twin, and many of the German scholars, and he just asked them for their material. Then he took the material and put it into a book that we could read. That book came out in 2012, asking the historical questions that should have been asked by Muslims throughout the centuries. Looked at the sources, the Islamic sources, and pointed to Quranic incongruities. Then he did a documentary called Islam, the Untold Story. Have any of you seen that documentary? Did you see it when it first came out? It didn't come out except once. It was only shown once on Channel 4 on August 28, 2012 at 9 p.m. It was not permitted to be shown a second time. Channel 4 would not show it a second time because of all the furore from the Muslims here in Britain. You can still go up online. You can get it on YouTube. I have it on my computer if anybody wants it. It's only 90 minutes long. And what he did, he took much of the material from In the Shadow of the Sword and put it together into a 90-minute broadcast. But he did not come to conclusions. He was very careful not to come to conclusions. And he did not touch the Quran. He did not want to touch the Quran. You'll see why next week. And then probably the best material that's come out is by this man, Dr. Dan Gibson, who wrote Quranic Geography. You can get it online. He's now putting it together into a movie. Quranic Geography came out, I think it was in 2011. And what he did is he started to look and see how Islam actually began. Dan Gibson is an archaeologist. His father is an archaeologist. His grandfather was an archaeologist. He lived amongst the Bedouins there in the Middle East for 20 years, learned their language, and then tried to go around trying to find out where all the geographical locations in the Quran were there in the Middle East. We're going to talk about him a little later because some of his material is absolutely earth-shattering. This is what they're finding. I'm just going to introduce this to you, and then we're going to come back to it. What they found is this. The first Arab inscription referencing Muhammad is not till 691. Muhammad died in 632. Isn't that interesting? There's no Arab reference to Muhammad earlier than 691. That's 60 years after he died. The first reference to Muslim, the word Muslim, is not till the 690s. So what did these people who were destroying and taking over Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo, what did they call themselves? Well, they called themselves Saracen, which is the Arab name for these people. They call themselves Hagarim because they are in the line of Hagar. They call themselves Ishmaelite because they are in a line through Hagar down to Ishmael, so therefore they would be in that line. They call themselves Maghreb because they come from the Maghreb, and they call themselves Mahajirun. These are the names they call themselves, those 5 names. The Mahajirun means people of the Hijr, people of the Exodus, people who are nomadic. The first reference to the word Islam is not till 691 on the Dome of the Rock, there in Jerusalem. And the first reference to the city of Mecca is not till 741. Muhammad died in 632. As you know, as I already said, the first biography of Muhammad is not till 833. Now let's unpack this and let's see what we're talking about. And let's start with Dan Gibson's material. Now Dan Gibson, when he was looking at the Quran, and you can do the same thing, he wanted to find out where the geographical locations were in the Quran. And he noticed there were 65 geographical locations. 9 places are named over and over again. And the names that come up over and over again are these people from Ad. 23 times it talks about this prophet who has contact and has relationship with these people from Ad. It doesn't mention who this prophet is. It just says the prophet, the messenger, the prophet, from the place of the prophet, from the place of the messenger. It doesn't refer to where he lives. Isn't that curious? In fact, you're not going to find reference to Muhammad. You will. There, in all the many, many references to Muhammad, take a look, you'll see they are all in parentheses, which means they've had to been put in at a later date. Muhammad's name is, in Arabic is only found 4 times. 3 times in one surah alone. 4 times. How many times is Jesus found in the Quran? Try 93. So this messenger has contact with these people from Ad 23 times. 24 times he has contact with these people from Thamud. And 7 times for these people from Midian. Ad, Thamud, Midian, where are they? Well, they're not around Mecca. They're way up here. 600 miles further north. But here's Mecca way down here. If he's living in Mecca, how come he's having these contacts, daily contacts with people that are 600 miles away? Put that under your hat and hold it a minute. Let's talk about Mecca. See, what we now know about Mecca, it's only referenced once in the entire Quran, and it talks about the valley of Mecca in Surah 48, Ayah 24. That's it. No other time does it talk about this place. Well, what do we know about Mecca? Well, we know that there's also reference to Bakka. We don't know if that is Mecca. We know that if you look at the traditions and you add them with the Quranic material, we do know right there that it's in a valley. We know that there's a parallel valley where the Mecca is. We know that it has a stream going through it, that it has a pillar of salt outside of it, because when this prophet goes past in the morning, he passes the pillar of salt. That's the wife of Lot. And when he comes in the evening, he passes that same pillar of salt. More than that, we know that there are fields, clay, grass, trees, loam, and olive trees That's curious. And that there are mountains overlooking the Kaaba.